You've been told silence is weakness, right? That if you don't speak up, you'll be forgotten. That if you don't fight to be heard, they'll just move on without a second thought. It's almost like the world trained you to believe your worth lies in your words, in your reactions, in how loud and available you are. But what if that's a lie? What if silence is not the absence of power, but the purest form of it? What if your stillness is not you disappearing, but you taking command? This article is going to flip everything you thought you knew about emotional strength, power dynamics, and what it really means to walk away. Because here's the truth. They didn't crumble when you begged. They didn't unravel when you cried. They didn't reflect when you poured out your soul. But they started falling apart the moment you stopped, the moment you went silent. That wasn't weakness, that was psychological thunder, and it's about time you understood how to use it, not for revenge, not for attention, but for freedom. Clarity, evolution. We're diving deep into the Stoic mindset where silence is not passive, it's tactical. It's not about running away, it's about stepping forward without noise. Because let's be real, if you've ever walked away from someone and wondered, will they even notice? This is for you. And if you're still hanging on by digital crumbs, hoping they see your story or decode your quote, then you already know something's off, something isn't working. But don't worry. This isn't about blame. This is about breakthrough. By the end of this, you're not just going to understand why silence breaks their control. You're going to know exactly what to do with it next, step by step. These aren't cliches. This is real psychological warfare for Stoic relationships, the kind of power that doesn't perform. It just exists. And its presence alone shakes everything they once thought they understood about you. So, stay with me, because what's coming next won't just make you feel seen, it will change the way you move forever. And once you internalize this shift, they won't just feel your absence, they'll fear it. Ready? Let's begin. 1. Silence is not absence, it's psychological power. They think silence is retreat. They think when you stop speaking, you've given up, backed down, surrendered. But those who truly understand power, true, lasting, deeply rooted power, know that silence is never passive. It's an act of discipline, of presence without performance. Think about it. When was the last time you got loud and felt truly in control? Was it when you were chasing clarity from someone who weaponized your vulnerability? Or was it when you sat still, calm, unreadable, and watched their ego begin to fracture without you lifting a single emotional finger? This is the essence of Stoicism, not just the absence of emotion, but the control over it. In Stoic relationships, silence is not a pause. It's a pivot, a shift from being emotionally available to being emotionally sovereign. Because here's the truth they won't tell you. People don't lose sleep over what they understand. They lose sleep over what they can't read. And when you go quiet, you become unreadable. You become a puzzle without an answer key, a presence that cannot be dismissed, a mirror they can't cover. This is not about ghosting. This is about growth. When your voice disappears from their world, what they're left with is not relief. It's reflection. And reflection is terrifying to someone who's been avoiding themselves through your constant emotional labor. Your silence turns into psychological thunder because you've removed the access. And when you remove access, the illusion of control crumbles. Now their mind spirals with questions. Are you mad? Have you moved on? Did you stop caring? Will you come back? And they won't ask, not because they don't want to know, but because their pride won't let them. So they sit, they scroll, they check, they guess. And every time they don't get a signal, the internal pressure rises. The thing is, silence is strategy. The same way a lion doesn't roar before it strikes, you don't need to declare your withdrawal. You simply stop feeding the pattern. And when the pattern breaks, they feel it not just in their head, but in their nervous system, because you were the comfort, the rhythm, the daily dose of emotional certainty. And now you're an unanswered question, and the mind doesn't let go of what it can't explain. That's the psychology of mystery. That's the blueprint of Stoic relationships. You stop reacting, and they stop understanding where they stand. And that's when they begin to crumble. Not because you yelled, not because you slammed the door, but because you didn't. Because you left it all in stillness, and stillness carries weight. Stillness is what lingers. When you explained yourself, you gave them a way out. When you cried, they could deflect. When you over-explained, they could excuse their own behavior. But when you say nothing, there's nowhere to hide. Just silence and their own conscience staring back. And that's what eats at them. That's what wakes them up at 2 a.m. wondering what just happened. That's what drives people mad. Because silence has no shape to manipulate. It has no edges to grab. It's not compliance. It's closure. They don't expect you to go quiet. They expect you to fight, to plead, to perform. And when you don't, they realize your presence wasn't just nice. It was necessary. That's why silence is the most powerful move in Stoic relationships. It's not punishment. It's precision. You're not playing games. You're playing for peace. And the price of that peace is their discomfort, their spiral, their reckoning. Yes, it will feel strange at first. You'll want to explain yourself, send one last message, give them one final chance to get it right. But what if I told you that silence is that final message? That your withdrawal says everything louder than your words ever could? You're not abandoning communication, you're abandoning chaos. You're choosing clarity without conversation. Because when someone has been trained to expect your constant emotional access, your silence becomes a vacuum. And vacuums demand to be filled. So they try, they throw out breadcrumbs, they post stories, they act unbothered, but it's all noise. Inside, they're spinning. Because when you take your energy back, their ego starves. And starving egos are loud, desperate, unsteady. They weren't addicted to your love. They were addicted to your attention. And when the attention dries up, their sense of importance evaporates. That's the shift. That's the collapse. That's why silence is not absence, it's transformation. And this kind of silence is earned. It comes from standing in your worth without having to explain it anymore. It comes from realizing that not every emotion deserves a response, and not every pattern deserves to be repeated. You don't need to prove you're right. You don't need to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. You just need to stop feeding dysfunction with your emotional currency. That's Stoicism in action. That's what it means to rise without a sound. And no, this doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care more about your peace than their confusion. It means you're no longer playing the emotional contortionist trying to fit into someone else's limited view of you. It means you've evolved, and evolution is always quiet at first. Think about a volcano. It doesn't announce its power with words. It builds pressure in silence. Then, one day, it erupts and changes the entire landscape. Your silence is that pressure. It's that shift. It's the moment they realize they can't touch you anymore, not because you vanished, but because you grew beyond reach. So ask yourself, who are you when you stop explaining yourself? Who do you become when you stop showing up for people who took your presence for granted? What does it feel like to stand in your stillness and trust that it's doing more than your words ever could? This is not about being cold. It's about being clear. It's not about being distant. It's about being defined. Silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means everything is. And the longer you hold it, the more powerful it becomes. Not as a tactic to hurt them, but as a method to heal you. You're not ignoring them. You're honoring yourself. You're not withholding closure. You are the closure. And that's why they're crumbling. Not because of the noise you made, but because of the noise you stopped making. That's the power of Stoicism. That's the language of Stoic relationships. No drama, no chase, just deliberate, focused withdrawal. Because sometimes the loudest exit is the one that doesn't slam the door. It just leaves and never looks back. 2. Predictability. Was their power, now you're a mystery. There's something deeply unnerving to the human psyche when something once predictable suddenly becomes unreadable. When you were always there, always responsive, always reacting, even in pain, even through tears, you gave them power, not because they earned it, but because they expected it. They knew your patterns. They knew if they ghosted you, you'd reach out. If they dropped a cryptic post, you'd decode it. If they sent a late-night message, you'd respond. They studied your emotional cycles the way a gambler studies odds. Not to understand you, but to manipulate outcomes. And that routine, that reliability, that emotional predictability was the foundation of their control. You were the safe bet, the emotional slot machine they could pull whenever they wanted to feel significant. Not because they loved you, but because they loved how you made them feel about themselves. But then something shifted. You changed. You went quiet. You stopped reacting. You became a blank page where they used to read you like a book. And now, they don't know what version of you they're dealing with. Is she mad? Is she indifferent? Is she done? The mind spirals when it's deprived of predictable feedback. That's when the ego begins to fracture, because the ego needs to anticipate in order to dominate. And you, my friend, have broken the pattern. In the philosophy of Stoicism, power is never in reaction, it's in control. And now, in this moment, you've taken back control without needing to lift a finger. You are no longer the girl who double texts, who sends long explanations, who tries to make sense of their emotional negligence. You're now the woman who watches in silence, unshaken, unbothered, unreadable. That is the quiet power of Stoic relationships. You no longer perform to be seen. You simply exist, fully, quietly, powerfully, and that presence alone destabilizes their entire narrative. Because unpredictability strips them of their influence. They can't use your patterns to predict your next move. They can't bait you, lure you, or distract you with emotional crumbs. You've removed the game board, and now they're left, holding the dice. That's why they panic. That's why they spiral. That's why they suddenly notice your absence isn't passive. It's calculated, and that calculation makes them question everything. This is where you begin to rise, quietly, consistently, without performance. No rage posts, no dramatic stories. Just stillness, just silence, just the unshakable glow of someone who no longer chases clarity through noise. This shift, this silence, this unreadable calm is the most powerful form of Stoicism in motion. Because when someone can't read you, they can't play you, they can't mold your reactions, they can't trigger your pain, they can't measure their importance through your emotion. Your unpredictability becomes the storm they never prepared for. And in that storm, they start to question everything they once felt so sure of. Because before, they could hurt you and still predict that you'd try to fix things. Now they hurt you, and you vanish. You don't flinch, you don't post, you don't bleed where they can see it, and that confuses the ego more than any confrontation ever could. Because it's not just your silence that haunts them, it's your unreadability. They don't know if you're healing, if you're moved on, or if you're planning something. That unknown creates chaos, and chaos to the ego is death. You're no longer predictable, and that unpredictability has become your armor, your shield, your declaration. You don't need to scream your worth. You need only to remove the script they once depended on. That is Stoicism, not just as a mindset, but as a strategy. To be unreadable is to be untouchable. To be unpredictable is to be unshakable. To be still when they expect you to break is the loudest rebellion. So now they sit in that confusion. They replay old messages. They try to retrace steps. They craft explanations in their head for why you've gone quiet. But the more they search, the more the silence stretches. The more they reach, the more they find nothing. Because you, the once predictable presence, have become the echo they can't locate. And that echo doesn't offer comfort. It offers discomfort. It makes them look inward. It forces them to realize they don't have access to your energy anymore. And energy, once removed, leaves a vacuum. That vacuum is what they now live in, and they'll try everything. Subtle texts, stories aimed at you, likes on old photos. They'll test the waters, but when you don't bite, when you remain silent, when your peace speaks louder than your pain ever did, that's when they feel the collapse. Not a collapse of you, but of their illusion of you. Because the version of you that used to explain everything, apologize first, beg to be understood, that version no longer exists. You've upgraded. You've leveled up into a version of you that isn't just silent. She's unreadable. And unreadable women are dangerous, not because they seek to hurt, but because they refuse to be hurt the same way again. And let's be clear, this unreadability isn't manipulation. It's evolution. It's what happens when you stop giving your emotional roadmap to people who only ever wanted shortcuts to control you. Now you're moving with intention, not impulse. You're listening to your peace, not your pain. You're reacting to nothing because there's nothing left in them to respond to. The emotional hook they used to grab you with no longer fits. That's what makes them spiral. That's what makes them lose sleep. That's what makes them start asking themselves the questions they once expected you to answer. And maybe, just maybe, that's the beginning of their reflection. Maybe now, in the absence of your emotional availability, they'll see what they've done. Maybe. Or maybe they won't. But that's not your problem anymore, because you've detached, fully, stoically, without announcement, without cruelty. Without seeking validation. That's the thing they didn't expect. They thought you'd break in your silence. Instead, you became still. And in that stillness, you found power. You stopped seeking control and became uncontrollable. You stopped seeking attention and became unforgettable. That's the paradox. When you were loud, you were easy to ignore. Now that you're quiet, you are the only thing they hear. Your mystery is your message. Your unreadability is your statement. And in Stoic relationships, that's all you need. Not noise, not explanation. Just the quiet, unwavering strength of someone who finally realized her predictability was her prison. And the moment she broke the pattern, she walked into power. Like this video, then like and comment #1 if this message is speaking directly to your spirit. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe. Because what's coming next? You don't want to miss the shift that will change everything. 3. Stop leaving breadcrumbs. Let them starve for closure. One of the most deceptive traps on the path to emotional freedom is the breadcrumb. Not the big, bold actions, not the messages or calls or explanations. It's the subtle ones, the half-posted quotes. The story you know they'll watch. The playlist you curate, hoping they'll feel it. It's the digital glance over the shoulder, the energy still leaking in their direction without a word. And the lie you tell yourself is this: it doesn't mean anything. It's just a post, just one view, just one like, but deep down, you know it's not nothing, it's a tether, a string you're still holding onto just in case they reach for the other end. And as long as that string exists, they'll never feel the full weight of your absence, because you haven't truly left. You've only pulled back. You're still there, in fragments, in echoes, in the almosts, and the maybes, and the what-ifs. And that keeps them comfortable. That gives their ego oxygen. And an ego that can still breathe won't feel the loss. So they scroll and see your shadow. They notice your quote and wonder, was that about me? And in that wondering they find comfort, not clarity, but comfort. They assume you're still emotionally available, even if not physically. Because availability isn't about proximity, it's about energy. And when you breadcrumb, you don't just linger. You prolong their illusion of importance. You keep the fantasy alive that they still matter in your world, that there's still a way back in, that they haven't been truly shut out. But why? Do we breadcrumb? Why is it so hard to cut it all off? Because it gives us just enough of a reaction to feel seen. It gives us that tiny jolt of attention, that microscopic sense of revenge. They watched it. They saw it. They're still checking. But here's the truth you're not admitting. Breadcrumbs aren't boundaries. They're bait, and bait is what you leave out when you still want to be chased. But if you're here, reading this, holding this silence, then deep down, you don't want to be chased anymore. You want peace. You want closure. You want to stop bleeding energy into someone who treated your soul like a convenience store. And peace doesn't come in pieces. Peace demands wholeness. It demands withdrawal, full withdrawal. Because until you remove all traces, they will keep feeding off the idea that they can come back when it's convenient, that you'll answer if they reach out, that you'll break eventually, that you'll miss them enough to post something obvious so they don't panic. Not yet. They don't feel the famine because you're still leaving crumbs. But when you stop, when you go completely dark, that's when the silence becomes starvation. That's when their ego collapses. That's when they feel the cold void of a connection they used to take for granted, not because you're being cruel, but because you're being clear. This is not about revenge. This is about reality. And the reality is, partial silence is just noise in disguise. You can't say you're done while still showing up in subtleties. You can't heal in the same digital spaces you were hurt in. And you certainly can't close a chapter you're still rereading. In Stoic relationships, there is no room for half presence. You are either in or you are gone. And when you are gone, your energy goes with you, completely, quietly, finally. That's when they notice. That's when they realize the door isn't cracked, it's closed. That's when they go back and scroll, only to find stillness. Not a single sign, not a whisper of you. That is when the loss becomes real, because they don't miss what is available. They miss what has vanished entirely, and you, in your stillness, in your decision, become untraceable and untraceable. People haunt the mind. Why? Because the mind craves closure. It craves predictability. It wants to understand, to explain, to box things in. And when you leave no trail, no final message, no clue, it spirals. It replays everything. It analyzes old messages. It searches for meaning. And every time it finds nothing, it fractures. A little more. That's the storm they didn't prepare for. They prepared for your reaction. They expected you to be loud. They thought they could handle your silence until it lasted longer than their pride. Until it grew into a void they could no longer ignore. And now the game is over, because you're not just quiet. You're gone, and gone is the one thing they never imagined you could be. You were always there, until one day you weren't. And no matter how many stories they post, how many indirect quotes they drop, how many little pings they throw your way, you don't move. You don't react. You don't return. That is when they starve. That is when they feel the ache. Not because you yelled, but because you didn't even whisper, because you disappeared without a trace, because you stopped trying to prove your worth in silence. You stopped performing pain for an audience that was never listening. You went dark, and in that darkness you found light, because now you're focused on you. Now your silence isn't just survival. It's rebirth, it's power. It's the sacred workshop where your broken pieces are coming back stronger, sharper, more defined. And there's no space in that workshop for breadcrumbs. Not anymore. You don't walk back into the fire just to show them you're not burning. You walk away and let the fire collapse on its own. You don't post for attention. You detach for transformation. That's stoicism. That's what it means to truly evolve. To stop signaling your healing and simply live it. Fully, boldly, quietly. Without breadcrumbs, because they don't need a hint, they need a void. They don't deserve a glimpse, they need absence. Not to suffer, but to reflect. And maybe they will, maybe they won't. But you won't be there to find out, because you've moved on. Not in a performance, in peace. Not in rage, in restoration, not to provoke, but to protect. And that is the essence of power. That is what Stoic relationships are built on. A firm, deliberate boundary that doesn't flex under loneliness, that doesn't bend for nostalgia, that doesn't soften just because they noticed a quote. Because you know your worth. And your worth doesn't live in someone else's reaction to your silence. It lives in your ability to hold the silence with discipline, to let it breathe, to let it speak, to let it teach them everything your voice could not. You don't need to close the story. You just need to stop writing in it. You don't need to make them feel it. You just need to stop feeding it. And when they try to come back to the page and find it blank, when they try to spark something and get nothing but silence, when they finally realize there are no more crumbs to follow, that's when they'll truly understand what they lost. Not because you told them, but because they finally sat in the silence they created, and that silence screamed. 4. Your silence triggers their reflection. When you stop speaking, something remarkable happens, not to you, but to them. The moment your words disappear from their world becomes a different place. Not immediately, not with a dramatic crash, but with a slow, creeping intensity that builds in the spaces you once filled with your care, your presence, your voice. At first, they may not notice. They may even feel relieved. Your silence, after all, gives them space to maintain the illusion that nothing is wrong, that they haven't really lost you. But as time stretches and your silence remains firm, it begins to shift. It begins to echo. The absence of your voice is not just quiet. It becomes a mirror. And that mirror, my friend, is what triggers everything they've worked so hard to avoid. When you were explaining yourself, they didn't have to reflect. When you were constantly clarifying your pain, your needs, your confusion, they got to sidestep theirs. Because as long as you were talking, they didn't have to listen to themselves. That's the illusion they lived in. But now there are no more explanations, no more emotional roadmaps, no more messages breaking down why you feel the way you do, no more translation of your love into digestible parts. And without a voice doing the emotional labor, they are left with something they never anticipated: their own thoughts, their own guilt, their own accountability. This is the storm they didn't see coming. Because silence, when used with intention, is the ultimate psychological boomerang. It turns everything inward, and the ego hates that. The ego thrives on deflection, on blame, on distraction. But when you go quiet, there's nothing left to deflect. No noise to blame, no words to manipulate, just them, alone with their actions, alone with their choices, alone with the truth they buried under your willingness to carry the emotional weight for both of you. That is the silent collapse. That is when the walls start to shake, because they're not hearing your voice anymore. They're hearing the echo of everything they said and did. And that echo is unforgiving. It plays back their patterns, their carelessness, their entitlement, their inconsistency, over and over. This is the moment they start to wonder, was I the problem? Did I push too far? Did I treat her like she'd always be there? The irony is, they won't say these things out loud. Most never will. Pride is too strong, but that doesn't mean the questions stop. They just bury them. They try to outrun the mirror, but mirrors don't need permission to reflect. And when you were the mirror, and now you're gone, what's left is the silence that won't let them forget. That is the point of your silence, not to make them suffer, but to remove the distraction, to cut off the noise, so that what remains is real. That's the beauty of Stoicism. It doesn't demand a reaction, it holds the line. It creates space for the truth to arrive on its own terms. And the truth is this: they knew what they were doing, even if they never said it, even if they pretended otherwise. They knew when they dismissed you. They knew when they didn't respond. They knew when they chose comfort over communication. And now, without your voice cushioning their impact, they feel the full weight of it. It lands, it cracks, it starts to haunt. And all those long messages you once sent, all those emotional breakdowns they barely acknowledged, suddenly they remember them, word for word, because memory is cruel when reflection is real, and reflection, triggered by silence, is as real as it gets. You think you need to remind them, you don't, they remember. You think you need to spell it out, you don't, they already know. But the difference now is that you're not around to protect them from the discomfort of knowing. You're not there to say, it's okay. You're not there to smooth it over. And that's what makes your silence so powerful. It gives back the responsibility they always dodged. You used to be the buffer, the filter, the one who made their behavior more palatable, sometimes even to yourself. But when you go quiet, you stop doing that. You stop making their actions look better than they were. You stop excusing, justifying, or interpreting. And in that stillness, the raw truth of who they were to you starts to surface. That truth is brutal, because it's no longer framed by your empathy. It's exposed by your absence. And that absence turns into pressure, into weight, into a slow burning awareness that maybe, just maybe, they didn't treat you the way they should have. And the more you remain silent, the more that truth grows. It creeps into their quiet moments, their scrolling, their memories, their 2 a.m. thoughts. And because you're not feeding the fire, they can't put it out. That's the lesson your silence teaches. Not in words, in weight, not in drama, in stillness, not in revenge, in restraint. That's stoicism. That's the practice. You do not react to feel powerful. You refrain to become powerful. And in doing so, you become something they can't categorize. You become the one who stopped showing up, not in anger, but in clarity. And they'll never admit it. But that clarity, it terrifies them, because now they don't get to rewrite the story. Now they can't claim confusion. Now they're left in a narrative where they were the ones who lost someone who simply stopped asking to be seen. And that kind of loss is unforgettable. That's what the silence does. It doesn't just remove your voice. It rewrites the power structure. You're no longer asking for validation. You're giving none. You're no longer explaining your pain. You're becoming the lesson. And lessons learned in silence, they stay with you forever. So don't break it, not yet. Don't explain yourself, not again. Don't give them another sentence to analyze, another emotional cue to read. Let the mirror speak, let the echo hit, let the questions swirl unanswered, because unanswered questions leave the deepest imprint. They haunt the mind, they chase the ego, they turn into long, sleepless nights and overanalyzed messages. They become the silence they never expected. And from that silence, they either evolve or they stay stuck. But either way, that's not your job to fix. Your job is done. You said enough. You tried enough. You gave enough. Now you leave. And in that leaving, in that pause, in that perfect void where they used to find your comfort, they meet themselves. Not the version they showed you. The real one. The one behind the excuses. The one behind the arrogance. The one that now has to sit in a room full of their own echoes and realize you're not coming back to explain it one more time. If you've felt this shift in your spirit, like and comment #1 right now. It's your time to stand in that clarity. And if you want to keep growing with us, don't forget to subscribe, because what's coming next is going to give you more than words ever could. It's going to give you ownership. 5. Growth is the real revenge. Revenge, as we've been taught, is dramatic. It's the post-glow-up photos, the passive-aggressive captions, the showy displays of "I'm better now." But here's the truth buried beneath all of that noise. Real revenge doesn't look like performance. It looks like evolution. It sounds like silence. It feels like peace. When you stop focusing on proving they lost something and start embodying the version of you they could never reach, that's when the power flips. That's when the story changes. Because what they didn't see coming wasn't your rage, it was your rebirth. They were prepared for backlash. They were even prepared for begging. What they didn't prepare for was complete and utter disinterest. A quiet, intentional transformation that excluded them entirely. And it wasn't fueled by hate, it was powered by dignity. They thought you'd orbit around their inconsistency forever. But now, the version of you that once tolerated the bare minimum no longer exists. You've stepped into someone they wouldn't recognize. And that realization cuts deeper than any sharp word you could have ever spoken. Growth is not loud. Growth is not glitter. Growth is not about showing off your progress like a trophy to the one who never respected your potential in the first place. Growth is getting so clear on your worth that you no longer feel the need to convince anyone else of it. In Stoic relationships, the glow-up isn't external, it's internal. It's the mental clarity, the emotional boundaries, the soul deep. A calm that radiates without effort. It's choosing peace when chaos calls. It's not reacting when provoked. It's no longer trying to decode someone who never made you a priority. It's outgrowing the need for closure because you've already become it. This is why your growth is what stings them the most. Not because they care in the way they should have cared, but because they don't understand how you moved on without their validation. They don't understand how you healed without their apology. They don't understand how you could have built something stronger on your own than what they ever offered you. And that confusion, that psychological chaos, is the price they pay for never listening when you were willing to explain. Now, the explaining is done. You've upgraded in silence. You've built your life not as a stage for them to watch, but as a sanctuary they're no longer invited into. They thought you needed them to evolve, but what they never realized is that your silence gave you the space to rediscover yourself, and in that rediscovery, you found the blueprint of a life that didn't include waiting to be chosen. You chose yourself. You reclaimed the hours spent overthinking, the days wasted waiting for replies, the sleepless nights wondering if they felt anything at all, and you turned them into building blocks. That's stoicism in practice. You don't scream at your enemies, you outgrow them. You don't announce your healing. You live it so deeply that it becomes your default, and while they may never say it, they feel it. They feel it in the conversations they can't have with you anymore. They feel it in the silence where your laughter used to be. They feel it when they look at their phone and realize they no longer have a window into your world. You are no longer a chapter, you are the closed book, and they don't have the key. And here's what truly cracks them. You're not doing it for show. You're not posting for their attention. You're not moving through life hoping they see what they missed. You're not dropping hints or planting clues or leaving the door cracked open. You've locked the door, thrown away the key, and built a new home without them even knowing it. That's what breaks them. The unpredictability, the uncertainty, the complete and total removal of their influence. Because when someone loses access to your energy, your reactions, your attention, what they're left with is a ghost. Not a haunting, but an emptiness that used to be full of your light. And light, once taken for granted, becomes unbearable when it's gone. That is why your growth is the ultimate revenge. Because it isn't about proving they were wrong. It's about becoming someone who would never tolerate what they offered in the first place. You're not just unavailable, you're unreachable. Not in bitterness, but in betterment. You're not hiding. You're glowing, quietly, purposefully, without need for acknowledgement. And yes, they might check, they might watch, they might wonder, but it doesn't matter. Because the glow-up they're witnessing isn't curated, it's real, it's raw, it's rooted in the kind of self-respect that doesn't need validation to breathe. You are becoming someone they never expected because they never saw your depth, your potential, your resilience. And now they don't get to. They don't get to witness this rise. They don't get to ask questions about how you got here. They don't get to apologize because you're no longer available for the apology tour. You've graduated, And graduation doesn't send out invitations to the ones who failed the test. This is the part they don't tell you. Healing doesn't always come with a grand finale. Sometimes it's a quiet, private evolution that nobody claps for, but that doesn't make it any less powerful. In fact, that makes it more powerful. Because the growth that happens when no one is watching is the kind that sticks, the kind that holds, the kind that transforms you from the inside out. And in Stoic relationships, that's the kind of growth that matters, not the performance. The permanence. You've stopped explaining your worth. You've stopped shrinking to be digestible. You've stopped waiting to be picked. And that shift, that's where freedom lives. That's where your identity starts to take shape outside of the chaos. That's where you remember who you are, not because someone told you, but because your silence gave you the space to listen. And what you heard was beautiful, strong, clear, unapologetic. You don't owe them a seat in your new life, not because you're petty, but because you're protective of your peace, your progress, your presence. You've stopped bleeding energy into black holes. You've started watering your own roots, and from those roots, something unshakable is growing. So, no, you're not proving anything. You're just living in such a way that nothing needs to be proven. That is the essence of Stoicism. That is what growth without noise looks like. And that's what they'll never forget. Not the arguments, not the messages, but the day they looked up and realized you were gone, not because you stormed out, but because you simply evolved, quietly, completely, unapologetically. 6. You're not being cold, you're taking command. There's a moment on this journey when someone is going to call you cold, distant, detached, heartless even. Not because you are, but because you stopped being available in the way that made their ego feel comfortable. You stopped being reactive. You stopped pouring out explanations. You stopped picking up the phone the second they dropped breadcrumbs. And that silence, that stillness, that self-control is something they never imagined you'd grow into. Because in their story, you were always the one who reached out, who over-explained, who gave second chances like candy and apologized for, asking for the bare minimum. But now you've stepped into a different space. A space where you don't owe anyone your presence just because they're uncomfortable with your absence. You've reclaimed the energy you once scattered freely. You've closed the doors they always assumed would stay open. And no, that doesn't make you cruel. That makes you clear. You're not ignoring them to be spiteful. You're honoring yourself enough to no longer tolerate what used to drain you. That's not coldness, that's command. That's emotional sovereignty, that's stoicism in its purest form. And here's what they'll never say out loud. They depended on your chaos, on your emotional highs and lows, on your reactions to feel powerful. Because your reaction was proof that they still had influence, that they still mattered. But now that you've gone quiet, now that you've become unreadable, the game is over, the control is gone, the feedback loop has shattered, and all they have left is their own discomfort, their own confusion, their own guilt. You didn't ghost them, you grew past them. And when you grow, you don't have time to perform for people who clapped the loudest when you were hurting. You no longer need to be heard to be validated. You no longer need to argue to feel seen. You no longer need to give access to people who misused it. That's not distance. That's discipline. That's the very heart of Stoic relationships. You've stopped managing their emotions. You've stopped softening your truth so they can sleep at night. You've stopped showing up in small, quiet ways just to keep the peace. Because now, your peace is not something you negotiate. It's something you protect. With silence, with stillness, with boundaries that don't need to be announced. And yes, they will misinterpret it. They will assume you don't care. They'll tell themselves, you're being dramatic. But let them sit with the silence, let them twist it however they need to, because this part of your life isn't about proving your intentions, it's about prioritizing your integrity. and people who benefited from your emotional availability will always mislabel your growth as coldness. Not because it is, but because it no longer serves them. Your silence is no longer a pause. It's a position, a posture, a clear, unmoving stance that says, I will not explain myself again. I will not chase what avoids me. I will not offer myself in pieces to someone who only shows up when they're hungry for attention. And in that stillness, in that shift, you become untouchable. Not in ego, but in essence, because you've stopped bending, you've stopped twisting, you've stopped being the easy option. And that unreadability, that unpredictability, that's what breaks their grip, because they can't reach for you anymore. You've removed the lever, the button, the emotional access point they used to press like clockwork, and now they're sitting in the quiet, realizing that the power they thought they had was never real. It only existed because you gave it to them. And now that you've reclaimed it, they don't know who you are anymore. You've become the mystery, the question mark, the untouchable force they can't manipulate. And here's the most powerful part. They don't even have the language to describe what they're feeling, because for the first time, they're not getting the script they're used to. You're not playing your part, you're not reacting on cue, and that unpredictability, combined with your silence, is their unraveling. That is what Stoic relationships protect, the inner sanctuary where your peace lives. And when someone can no longer disrupt that, no longer pull you into cycles, no longer extract emotion from your stillness, they lose their footing. Their ego collapses, not because you pushed, but because you stopped responding, because the greatest command is not found in how loud you are. It's found in how calm you remain. You are not a cold person. You are a clear one. You are not being silent to punish. You are being silent to protect. You are no longer emotionally reacting because you've learned to emotionally regulate. You've trained yourself to recognize the bait and walk away, not because it doesn't hurt, but because your healing matters more. This is mastery. This is strength. This is power, the kind of power that doesn't flex, it just is. And now, in this space, you don't have to defend your choices. You don't have to prove you cared. You don't have to circle back just to explain why you stopped engaging. You get to move forward, quietly, intentionally, fully. And that's what unnerves them. You're not blocked. You're just not available. You're not angry. You're just not reactive. You're not vengeful. You're just not accessible. That's how they know it's real. That's how they feel the shift. Not in your volume, but in your vacuum. In the space they once filled with games and manipulation, there is now nothing. And in that nothing, they realize what they lost. Not just your presence, but your permission, your openness, your softness. You've pulled it all back. And in doing so, you've pulled the curtain back on their illusion of power. You don't have to fight anymore. You don't have to explain. You don't have to ask why they did what they did, because the most powerful people don't ask for understanding. They choose self-respect over confusion, and that's you now. So if this shift is resonating with you, like and comment number 1 to let me know you're done being emotionally predictable. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button, because what's coming next will take your power to a whole new level. You didn't win by being louder. You didn't reclaim your worth by forcing them to understand. You didn't rebuild yourself by trying to convince someone to see what was always there. You rose because you got quiet. You shifted inward. You stopped negotiating your worth in conversations that only led to confusion. You stopped fighting for closure and became it. And that, right there, is the difference between reaction and command. Between spiraling and evolving, between being trapped in someone's emotional maze and walking out of it with your head high, your spirit clean, and your soul undisturbed. In the silence, you didn't find emptiness. You found structure. You found intention. You created space to hear your own voice again, the one that had been drowned out for so long by overthinking, by over-explaining, by hoping that one more conversation would fix what had been broken in silence long before words were even needed. What they never expected was that you would stop performing, that you would stop being a character in their story, that you would write your own. You see, this wasn't about hurting them, it was about healing you. And healing doesn't come with fanfare. It comes in the quiet mornings where you choose not to check their page. It comes in the late nights where your silence wraps around you like armor instead of a void. It comes in the way you no longer chase the familiar pain of needing to be needed. That's the transformation. That's what they don't teach you, that healing often looks like stillness. That stoicism isn't being numb, it's being deeply aware, but choosing not to let chaos pull you under. It's the art of restraint, the elegance of not reacting, the power of non-performance. And when you stop performing, you stop participating. In dynamics that require you to abandon yourself just to keep the peace, your silence has not been passive. It has been active, alive, intentional, strategic. You've used it to pull your energy out of the spaces where it was being drained. You've used it to cut off the supply to egos that fed off your emotional instability. You've used it to see clearly, not just who they were, but who you were becoming every time you chose yourself over the urge to explain. And yes, it was hard. At first, silence feels like surrender, like defeat, like giving up. But with time, it becomes the strongest boundary you've ever held. It becomes your proof that you no longer seek identity in the noise. You no longer find your value in how someone responds to your pain. You've built something stronger, something no one can take from you. Presence. Presence without performance. Presence without needing to be decoded. Presence that says, I don't owe you access just because you're curious. And that's what changed everything, because once you truly understand the weight of your presence, you stop offering it in pieces. You stop scattering it for attention. You stop making it digestible for people who never sat with the fullness of who you are. You don't rage your way out. You don't beg your way to closure. You just go quiet, and in that quiet, you return home to yourself. This is where your power lives now. In the boundaries that don't need to be announced, in the dignity of not needing to be right, in the strength of not needing to be understood by people who never tried, and they will feel it. Not because you made them, but because the void you left is louder than any words you could have spoken. That's the irony. They thought your silence would make them forget you. But instead, it etched you into the deepest parts of their mind, the parts that ask questions at 3 a.m., the parts that scroll through memories and try to rewrite what they never had the courage to face in real time. Because your absence was never passive, it was deliberate, clean, sharp, and now you are no longer someone who needs to show her growth to be validated. You live it, you breathe it, you embody it, not as a reaction but as a reality, because Stoic relationships aren't about detachment from feeling, they're about detachment from dysfunction. They are built on calm self-possession, not control, on inner alignment, not external approval. And you, in this silence, have built something unshakable. You've stopped leaking energy. You've stopped breadcrumbing closure. You've stopped seeking emotional receipts from people who never had the capacity to receive your truth. And that's why you're free. Not because they changed, but because you did. And that change didn't come with fire and fury. It came quietly, like the rising sun, like the tide shifting, like breath returning after holding it for too long. It came from within. It came because you finally decided that peace mattered more than being seen by someone committed to misunderstanding you. It came because you realized that your time, your energy, your presence is sacred, and not everyone deserves to witness your evolution, especially not the ones who watched you break and did nothing. Now, you don't explain, you don't argue, you don't even announce your exit. You simply walk. And in that walking, you command the deepest kind of attention, the kind that leaves people awake at night, wondering how they missed the moment when you changed, when you stopped answering, when you stopped reacting, when you stopped being who they could control. That's when they unravel, And you rise quietly, fully, unbothered. That's the power of silence. That's the language of transformation. That's the lesson that will echo longer than any goodbye ever could.